Real quick things just before we get going, and I promise to be very brief. I'm going to mention that there's no drink or food in the auditorium. Later there'll be snacks outside, so we're going to take a break around 7:50, 8 o'clock, thereabout. We'll have about a 15-minute break. There are restrooms on the left as you walk out. And a couple of just real quick things here. We have something for Dr. Jeff Poet. Dr. Poet was just very helpful at getting all this sponsored with the navigators and all the logistics and whatnot at the school. And so this is a book for you, signed by Dr. Heiser. And thank you for everything you did.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And we have a sweatshirt from the school for our speaker, Dr. Michael Heiser, Missouri Western. You're welcome. Without any further ado, I'll introduce him, Dr. Michael Heiser.
Well, I'm going to try to follow instructions here. Good luck with that. Are we on? The screen? Yes. I'll try not to bump that too much. Audio's fine? Yes. Okay. Well, thanks for coming. I don't know how many of you know anything about me, which may or may not be a good thing. We'll find out. But what we're going to do tonight is, if you have a copy of the schedule, there was one on the little podium out there, the little lectern. If you didn't get it, you might want to go back and grab one quickly, or Will can hand them out. We're going to be talking about tonight a couple of things that will simultaneously be a little bit familiar, but also a little bit strange when it comes to this thing I have here displayed, the supernatural worldview of the Bible. Now, for those of you who are, broadly maybe in the religion department, just your academics, what I want to get at tonight is pretty specific. How would an ancient person process what they read in the Bible? What was originally written for them? And that's another way of saying when the biblical books were written. Again, I'm not concerned about the process. I'm not concerned about source criticism or anything like that. We're not going to do any of that tonight. We're going to be operating from and to sort of drift into academic speak a little bit, the received text, the canonical text, the text that the Jewish community considered sacred, hence the term canonical, and also the early church who received the Jewish Bible, again, as it was existing at the time, and also their own books of the New Testament as those came to be written. We're going to be talking about all those things. We're going to be including passages from both of those tonight and, of course, tomorrow as well. But again, we're dealing with the text as we have it. How would an ancient person process that? What would certain things mean to them? And I like to illustrate it this way. For those of you who were raised in a church or go to a church now, my illustration would be something along the lines of, you're in a small group Bible study, maybe even a classroom, and you're going around the room and you're looking at a particular passage and discussing a certain topic, and everyone sort of is expected to have their input. Hey, what do you think this verse means? What in the world is the writer talking about here? If you had someone from the second millennium BC sitting in the room, someone from the 1st century AD or CE sitting in the room, when you got to that person, that guy or that girl, their answer to what does this passage say, what do you think it means, is going to be a lot different than we would hear today in church or in a Bible class or something like that. And the reason is really simple, because they come from another time and place. So what I want to challenge you with is, I'd like, if I want to accomplish anything tonight, it's that you go away with a little bit more of the ancient writer in your head. Because we have been trained, because we're modern. We can't help it, we're modern. This is the 21st century. We think differently because of all sorts of reasons, the Enlightenment, historical forces, technology, science, whatever. We think quite differently than an ancient person would, but yet we've sort of been anesthetized to the fact that what an ancient writer was writing and how it was received by their original audience is actually quite different than the way we would think now. And the only way you can really process a number of things in the Bible is to have the ancient person in your head. We've been sort of reflexively trained to think that the correct context for interpreting the Bible is ours, or the history of Christianity, the Reformation, the Catholic Church, evangelicalism. Okay? None of those contexts are the correct context for interpreting the Bible. They are all foreign contexts when it comes to the original writers and the original recipients. And so, in the sessions we have tonight, I'm just literally picking and choosing certain things to give you a broad overview, sort of a bird's eye view of the content that I've written in the book that's out at the front, The Unseen Realm, subtitled Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible. The wording is deliberate because we just don't think this way anymore. So if you're interested in biblical studies, at all, and especially if you assign sacred status to the Bible, there are some things, again, that you just need to have in your head to really understand it correctly. And it matters for all sorts of things in Bible and biblical theology. So let's jump in here. The first thing we want to talk about is sort of fundamental to an Israelite's worldview. So we're going to start with the Old Testament. Ancient Israelite, something called the Divine Council, that is going to be foreign to many of you, but which would have been elementary, again, to an ancient Israelite. And sort of the textbook passage is Psalm 82. Now I have here Psalm 82. This is the ESV, English Standard Version, very common version. And what I want you to notice here, in the first verse, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. The word God here is highlighted in blue, and the column here is highlighted in blue. And this is just a graphic illustration from something called a reverse interlinear Bible, which the company I work for produces, to show you that the word God here is the word Elohim. Very common word for God. Many of you have probably heard that. Okay, nothing really surprising here. However, if you keep going in the verse, we have, in the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Gods here now highlighted in blue. That is also Elohim. So you have the same word, Elohim, occur 2 times in the same verse. The first time, it's translated singularly, and there are good reasons for that. Grammar. Okay, in Hebrew, it's Elohim Nitzav Ba'ada'el. Nitzav is the verb form, the participle. It's singular. It tells you, hey, the subject that goes with this is Elohim, translated as a singular for grammatical agreement. The second one, in the midst of the gods, and in geek speak, compound preposition, in the midst of, and we have Elohim. You can't be in the midst of one entity. Midst, okay, as far as a group goes, means you need to translate it plural, and the ESV reflects that. So, take a look at the verse. I narrate my own little story in the book. I had taught biblical studies on the college level for 5 years. I had been to 2 different seminaries. I was in a doctoral program in Hebrew Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I had never looked at Psalm 82:1 in Hebrew. And the first time I did, it was sort of mind-altering, because it sounds like a pantheon. And Old Testament theology, Israelite theology, Israelite religion is not supposed to have a pantheon. But right there it is in Psalm 82 verse 1, in black and white, so to speak, in Hebrew. Elohim 2 times, one singular, one plural. Now, if you go down to verse 6, the speaker in the psalm is, at this point in the psalm, God. Verses 2 to 5, God is raking the gods of the council over the coals. He's mad at them because they're unjust. They oppress the poor, they're corrupt, and he starts going after them. And he says in verse 6, I said, your gods, and then we have Elohim again, sons of the Most High, all of you. Again, it has to be plural. Sons, okay? And we have you, plural pronoun. Again, it has to be plural. There's no way to get around it. Now, what many who do encounter this, if you have a study Bible, if you're looking at that, you might get a footnote, something to the effect that, oh, well, the gods here in Psalm 82, don't worry, there's nothing to observe here. Okay, just keep going on your way, because the gods here are just people. They're, Israelite elders or something like that, the judges of Israel from Exodus 18, when Moses appointed elders at the suggestion of Jethro, his father-in-law, at Sinai. Well, that doesn't work real well. If you go over to Psalm 89, it doesn't work real well for lots of reasons, but here's one of them. You've got verse 5 here, let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. And then we have that idea, assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings? And the Hebrew is the name Elohim. Elohim is another plural with El in this case. Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? The last time I checked, there is no council of Israelite judges that lives in the skies and that runs the affairs of the world from the skies. It just doesn't work. But I'm telling you, if you go to standard commentaries, study Bibles, things like that, that is what you're going to read. Nothing to see here. Don't be troubled. It's just people. And people don't live in the skies. This isn't like Lando Calrissian, the Sky City and all that stuff. We don't have that in the Hebrew Bible. So what do we do? What do we do with this sort of thing? Well, we want to talk about that, again, because this is part of the Israelite worldview. Jesus certainly knew Psalm 82. He quotes it in John chapter 10. And it isn't people there either. He's quoting verse 6, which we just saw. The apostles certainly knew Psalm 82. Lots of Jewish rabbis through the centuries knew Psalm 82. The Israelites knew Psalm 82, and yet, again, they're monotheistic. Well, how in the world does this work? So we have a number of references to sons of God. And I've just listed a few. We will hit Deuteronomy 32:8. There's a reason for the asterisk there. We'll hit that in a moment. But this is not an uncommon term. Everywhere else, B'nai Elohim or B'nai Elohim occurs. You're going to have a plural divine being situation. Again, this heavenly host, heavenly council. Again, we might hit Genesis 6 in a Q&A. There's also a lot of verses where God is among or above the Elohim or the Elohim. So, if the Israelite writer, if the biblical writer didn't believe that the gods were real, and that is the proposition here tonight as we start off, that the biblical writers believed the gods were real, why would they be writing that, hey, our God is above all those other gods? Our God is among them, but better than them. I mean, if they're just cartoon beings, it sort of strips the magnitude, it strips the glory out of it. It'd be like me saying, hey, my God's better than Spider-Man. Ooh, wow, that's fascinating. Spider-Man's a fictional character. I'm better than him too, because I at least exist. You can't, again, reduce the content of what you actually see in the biblical text to some sort of cartoonish status. That is not the way an Israelite looked at it. Deuteronomy 32:17 right here is kind of interesting because it refers to the Elohim with another term. We'll hit this again a little bit later too. It refers to the Elohim as the Shadim. Most of your English translations will translate that as demons. It's kind of it's a workable translation. It's kind of clunky. But the fact is that the Elohim in Deuteronomy 32:17 were considered real and real threats, and we don't worship them. Paul, the Apostle Paul, quotes Deuteronomy 32:17 in 1 Corinthians 10, also using the term demons. So if you're thinking, I want to understand the Bible the way the biblical writers understood it, but I'm not going to accept the fact that they would have believed the gods were real, well then you have to go to 1 Corinthians 10 where Paul quotes this passage and deny that Paul believed in demons too. Again, it's just a strategy that doesn't work. But I understand, again, why we have this sort of sensibility, because when we see the word God today in a modern context, whether it's a Christian context or a Jewish context, Islamic context, any theistic religion, and even outside, that little box there. When we see God, we sort of mentally assume and assign a specific set of attributes to God. Things like omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. Again, the familiar sort of grocery list that we learn in Bible doctrine in church or catechism or something like that. When we see those consonants in the vowel, God, see that word, see those letters, our mind just assigns attributes to them. And then we think of verses that have these phrases, where God says, there is none besides me, there is none like me. Besides me, there is no other. And just based upon what I've already shown you, it should raise, again, a question. Well, how can they say this, and yet go back to Psalm 82 and Psalm 89? And again, the other passage that I just had in list form here, that talk about God is among the gods and greater than gods, and sons of God who are gods. How can you do this? How can you say all of this stuff in the same sacred text? How does it work? Well, for modern Christians and really modern Jews, I always think of my advisor when I think of this in Wisconsin, who was what I would call a serious Jew, maybe not very conservative theologically, but a serious one. Our solution to this is just deny that the other gods exist. That's silly. Again, we impose our conception on that of the ancient person. Again, but if you start denying those things, you have to deny other things attached to them. Again, like Paul's quotation. You just have to interpret the text as a modern person, not as an ancient person. Now, you can do whatever you want, but you can't call it biblical theology when you do it, is the point. You're either going to have your theology derived from the text, and if this is a sacred text for you, it's important, or you're not. Well, these phrases, again, occur a number of places, and I would suggest to you, they are not denials of the existence of other gods, because then you'd have a pretty well hopeless contradiction. What they are is they are statements of the incomparability of one God to the other ones. Okay. Statements of incomparability versus statements of non-existence. Now, this is actually pretty easy to demonstrate. This was part of my dissertation, and I'm certainly not going to bore you with that. But fundamentally, you have a problem because the denial, these so-called denial statements, there's none besides me, they show up in Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32 we've already talked about a little bit. That elsewhere affirm the existence of other gods in the same chapter. So again, how do we deal with this? I think these are the two verses that are key. The same denial phrases show up in both of these passages, Isaiah 47:8-10, and then Zephaniah 2. In one passage, the city of Babylon says, there is none besides me. And in the other passage, it's the city of Nineveh, saying, there's none like me, there is none besides me. Now, are we really going to believe that the biblical writer was so dumb to put such a statement in the mouth of Babylon? I'm the only city that there is in the world. All other cities don't exist. there's none besides you. Is that really what the writer meant? Of course not. It's absurd. What the writer meant to put in the mouth of Babylon, Babylon's often the villain in the Old Testament. And Nineveh was just awful because it was associated with the Assyrians, who were the Klingons of the Old Testament, if you want to think of it that way. Just bad dudes, okay? Nineveh and Babylon are typical enemies in the Old Testament story. And what they mean to say here is that we're the best. Babylon says there's none besides me. There is no city on the planet like me, like us, like Babylon. And Nineveh makes the same claim. They're not statements that other cities don't exist. They're statements of incomparability. It's actually not very complicated. But again, we think it's complicated because when we see God, we assign a unique set of attributes to the word, and then we go to, again, these denial statements and say, well, this isn't possible. The other gods can't exist in the mind of a biblical writer. You know, or we just say, hey, this is freaking me out because we believe in monotheism. How can we do this? And then how can we be monotheists when we go to the biblical text and see this stuff? There's actually a fairly simple way to do this. What we have is a cultural context problem. A modern context, that would be us, versus the biblical writers, and again, the original recipients, their context. It's just different worldviews, different ways of thinking about the same thing. The answers are actually right in front of us in the biblical text. If you ask yourself the question, who or what is or are Elohim? What you would find, if you, again, do a search, I'm not going to, again, bore you with little tricks in Bible software and produce the search for you, but I can just give you the results here. Elohim, again, that word that shows up twice in Psalm 82, once singular, once plural, in meaning, is actually used of half a dozen different entities in the Hebrew Bible. God of Israel is an obvious one. The gods of the council, the gods of the nations, for instance, Ashtoreth, who is a goddess. Biblical Hebrew actually doesn't have a word for goddess, by the way. It doesn't use the feminine form. It just refers to the goddess as Elohim, which is a grammatically masculine term. Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom, the Elohim of the Ammonites. So you have the gods of the nations. You have, again, demons, quote unquote, the Shadim in Deuteronomy 32:17. The disembodied human dead are referred to as Elohim in 1 Samuel 28:13. For those of you who don't recall this incident, this passage, 1 Samuel 28 is the story of the witch or the medium at Endor, where Saul, the king of Israel, has run all the mediums, the people who practice necromancy and all this other stuff. He's run them out of the country. But somehow he knows where to find one when he needs one. And he goes to a medium who lives at Endor and goes to her in disguise, doesn't tell her who he is, and says, I need you to contact Samuel for me. Now, Samuel was a prophet. He was the person who anointed Saul. Samuel had recently died. And Saul is in big trouble with the Philistines. It looks like the end for him, and he needs to consult Samuel because the biblical text says God was not hearing his prayers. So he goes to the meeting at Endor and says, I need to talk to Samuel. Can you do the job? And she agrees, and while she's doing her thing, she says, whoa, I see an Elohim coming up out of the ground. And Saul's first question, and really before he gets to articulate it, once she sees him, she turns to Saul and gets freaked out. You're Saul. In other words, she does the math in her head there, and he's like, don't worry, I'm not going to tell you or punish you. What does he look like? And she describes him, and Saul's like, yep, that's him. And they have a conversation where the disembodied Samuel essentially repeats information that God had given him earlier in his life about Saul and his fate. It basically says, why did you bother me your toast, now leave me alone. That's my translation there. But we have, again, the disembodied human dead referred to as Elohim. And we have at least one angel referred to as Elohim. Again, you have to put a few passages together. We'll talk about Genesis 48, which is a really important one, a little later tonight. But here's the question. Would the biblical writer see all of these things on the same level? In other words, would the biblical writer assume that, hey, my dead Aunt Rivka is on an ontological par with the God of Israel? They're basically the same in attributes. Really? Your dead aunt and the God of Israel, like the same? It's ridiculous. But yet, if Elohim is used to denote a specific set of attributes, the way we think of God, that's what you have to say. You're saying that when you see the term Elohim, there are certain attributes that go with it. And if you have more than one of them, then you have polytheism. That is not the way a biblical writer would have processed the terminology. A biblical writer is no fool. He doesn't believe, again, that the Shadim are as powerful as the God of Israel. He doesn't believe that the human dead are as powerful as the God of Israel. But yet he uses the same terminology for all of them. That alone should tell you that Elohim does not mean a specific set of attributes. It is not to be aligned with a specific set of attributes. That is not the way the biblical writer is. In other words, the biblical writer is not using Elohim the way we use God. So, what is he talking about? What Elohim really means, really denotes, is probably a better way to say it. For the biblical writer, and again, the original Israelite context, you would use Elohim to describe a being or an entity that by nature was disembodied and an inhabitant of the spiritual world. That's what Elohim means. If you are by nature, not embodied, your body less, your spirit being, and you are an occupant of the spirit world, you are, by definition, an Elohim. Now, in that realm, in that neighborhood, again, here we have the neighborhood. Gods of the council, the demons, disembodied dead, angels, and of course, Yahweh, God of Israel. And we're going to talk about Godhead thinking in the Old Testament a little bit later tonight. All of those are inhabitants of the spiritual world. Now, in that world, in that neighborhood, there is rank. There is hierarchy. There is differentiation of attributes. Here's what an Orthodox Israelite would have believed. If you walked up, let's just use Abraham as our little pretend example. If you walked up to Abraham and said, hey, Abe, is there more than one Elohim? Abraham would look at you and say, well, duh. Of course. If your next question was, and those guys are all the same, right? He probably would punch you in the face. Okay. No. Yahweh, the God of Israel, is an Elohim. But no other Elohim is Yahweh. That is what an Orthodox Israelite, a biblical writer, would have believed. Because they're not using Elohim to denote the specifically unique attributes of Yahweh. Now they do that in other ways. Yahweh, the Elohim that is Yahweh, is described as the creator. None of the other Elohim are. Psalm 29 has B'nai Elim, a command to them to worship Yahweh. He's the one who deserves worship. His followers are to worship no other. He is the rightful recipient of human worship. They describe Yahweh as sovereign over the affairs of humanity. No other Elohim get described that way. There are passages that credit Yahweh with creating all the other ones. It's never the other way around. Okay, so a biblical writer had ways to distinguish Yahweh as unique. But one of those ways was not using the term Elohim. So if you go back to Psalm 82, you do not have polytheism like we think of it. We impose that on the passage because we see the plural term. But it has nothing to do with attributes. Psalm 82 is about God presiding over a council, an assembly, a group, a host, whatever you want to call it, of spirit beings. Now, in that case, who happen to be in charge of the nations. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So in terms of council language, if you were to take biblical language about the divine council and its members, and you would compare that, we'll say, this is a very common conception in the ancient world. All ancient religions had pantheons. The issue is, how did they parse the relationships, and how did they parse the attributes? For an Orthodox Israelite, you would have Yahweh at the top, never the potential to remove him. He is omnipotent, he's sovereign, he's the creator, he's this, he's that, he's all this stuff that we traditionally think about God in the Judeo-Christian worldview. He is at the top. The sons of God are in the middle tier. It's a three-tiered system in Israelite thinking and like Canaanite thinking, other ancient religions. This term is not an ontological one, it's a functional one. Sons of God is like the divine household, the inner circle. The ones that, not necessarily having different powers or different attributes, but who have different roles, very important tasks. And then at the bottom are the malachim, which is the Hebrew word for messenger or angel. The Greek term is angelos, that's where we get angel. It just means messenger. This is the lowest rank because their job is to, take and bring messages. That's what they do. They're not assigned in the biblical, again, the biblical writer's view of the supernatural world, how it all works. They're never assigned high-level tasks. It's a low-level task. Now, there's one exception to this, the Malach Adonai, the angel of the Lord. And the reason he's different is because he is identified with and as Yahweh in a few passages. So that's a special case. We'll get to that later tonight. You also have throne guardians, sort of staff people, entities. Cherubim is a throne guardian. It comes from an Akkadian term, karuv. Seraphim is the same thing. It just comes from an Egyptian term, seraph. Either serpent or burning, and probably both. So they're throne guardians in each different culture. And if we get to Q&A, we can talk about why one text uses a term from Mesopotamia, another one uses an Egyptian term. We can talk about that. But this is, again, how things are distinguished. And the reason this is not polytheism, to back up again, is because the plural language has nothing to do with attributes or ontology in terms of a unique set of attributes. It's about what neighborhood you belong in. It's also not henotheism, because in a henotheistic system, it's closer to henotheism than polytheism, but it's not henotheism because in a henotheistic system, the top deity can be displaced and replaced. There's the potential for another god to elevate to the highest position and sort of win that position. And you're not going to find anything in the Hebrew Bible that talks that way about the spiritual world in Israelite thinking. Now, does God need a council? I get this question a lot when I do this presentation. Mike, this is crazy talk. God doesn't need a council. You're making God sound like he's dependent and he needs help. Okay, can I just talk to the Christians here in the audience for a moment? He doesn't need you either. Okay, there's this thing called the Great Commission. Okay, God decided, hey, I want humans to participate in this thing that I could do in an instant, but I'm not going to do it in an instant. I'm going to have people, my imagers, my children, participate with me to recover and reclaim the nations. Again, that's a phrase that I'll come back to in a moment. Oh, you're right, God doesn't need a council, but he does choose to use one. This is the language of the Hebrew Bible. He doesn't need anybody, but he chooses to use agents, whether they're spiritual beings, like angels, or they're human beings, like you. He doesn't need the help, but this is the way he does it. This is what Scripture describes. Now, there are certain council members in rebellion. We find out from different passages. Deuteronomy 32 is one. Keep coming back to that passage. Psalm 82, these are two really important passages. They are excluded from the council because they are disloyal in biblical thinking. They do their thing in an adversarial way to the God of Israel and his children on earth, and again in the spirit world. There's conflict, there's turmoil, there's warfare. Okay, people like that's sort of a buzzword in Christian circles, spiritual warfare. And that is a picture you get not just from the New Testament, but from the Old Testament as well. There is conflict and turmoil and a battle, okay, if you will. Not everyone is on the same team. And again, participatory governance is a big deal. We might hit imaging a little bit later. Let's talk about the gods of the nations. I mentioned this briefly a couple of times, and I think this is something that will be new to just about everyone here, unless you've sort of read ahead. Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. If you have the ESV or the new NRSV, you will get these two verses correct. The ESV, again, is I think is the better one because it includes the material in the right text. Here's the issue. If you have another version, go ahead and open it. Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9. Because what you read here, you're not going to read on your lap. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, when did that happen in the biblical story? The Tower of Babel. So everybody gets scattered, the nations are divided, all that stuff. When the Most High did that, we know what the Most High is in biblical thinking. He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. And then later in the same chapter we have, rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods. Again, you won't read this either if you have something different than ESV and probably NRSV at that point. The reason is the ESV incorporates the Dead Sea Scroll reading for this verse in its running translation. The other ones do not. The other versions are going to read, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. And then this verse is not going to have any reference to gods at all. It's a different Hebrew text, one that cannot be traced back to Qumran, to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, scholars have known about this for a really, really, really long time, even before the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, reads angels here. And down here it'll have a reference to angels as well. So if you're going with the oldest Hebrew text available to us today, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is what you're reading. But you don't need to be a textual critic to know that this is the correct reading. Let's just put our thinking caps on here. If the nations were divided at Babel, Tower of Babel event, why doesn't it make sense to say that God divided them up according to the number of the sons of Israel?
Israel wasn't established.
A little louder.
It's more than 12.
Israel
That he
wasn't
portions
established.
Israel to himself.
Israel wasn't established. There was no Israel. Abraham is only called after the Babel event. Israel does not exist at the Tower of Babel. So it makes no sense to say he numbered them according to the sons of Israel. Israel's not even around. It doesn't even exist. If you look at the table of nations, Genesis 10, the Babel story is Genesis 11. If you look at the table of nations, Genesis 10, where the Old Testament, all the nations of the world that descended from Noah's sons in the biblical story are listed. Guess who's not there? Israel. Israel doesn't exist. So a reading that says sons of Israel makes zero sense. And textually, it's not the demonstrably best text. Okay? This is why the ESV decided, you know what, instead of putting it in a footnote, a lot of translations will have a footnote at the end of the line. We're going to put it right in the running text because it's just obvious that this is what the original text would have read. So they did it. That was an editorial decision. Here is the Qumran scroll, and in transliteration, the Hebrew alphabet, the name Elohim, and right here, Qumran handwriting is pretty crummy, actually. Not nice and neat like our block script, Bet, Nun, Yod, B'nai, Elohim at the end here. This is the mem, final mem chopped off a little bit because the text is fragmentary, but it is there. Okay. This is 4Q Deuteronomy K for the text geeks here. Now, what does it all mean, though? What does Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 mean? When the Most High divided the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. What it means is that the table of nations here, these are all the nations listed in Genesis 10. Put yourself in the biblical story. We're after the flood, we've got the descendants of Noah. God reiterates the command to be fruitful and multiply after the flood to Noah and his family. So what God wants them to do is to spread through the earth and do what they were supposed to do in Eden, what Adam and Eve were supposed to do in Eden. What were they supposed to do? They were to make the rest of the planet like Eden. Subdue the earth, go out there, this is where the presence of God is, this is as close to paradise as we're going to get. Now we want you to go out and spread what you see here out there so that the kingdom of God can spread throughout the earth. Of course, we know that didn't work here. But what do they do instead? No. We like Babylon. So some of them, go out, but there are a bunch that congregates in Babylon. And eventually, that's where the story, takes us. They're building a ziggurat in Babylon, a tower. Anybody know what a ziggurat is? Those stair-step kind of pyramid things. Not the nice pyramids with even sides that you see in Egypt. They're like step pyramids. There's a couple of those in Egypt too. But what is it for? Well, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, Babylon, were part of temple complexes. They were specifically designed to create a place for the deity to come and meet with the people. In other words, they localized the deity. It's the exact opposite of what God told them to do. Instead of spread the earth and make worshipers of me everywhere and all that sort of stuff, it's like, no, we're going to build you a little shrine here. Actually, it's a pretty big one. And you're going to come to us. We're going to localize you. And in response, God says, forget that. Just forget it. You don't want to listen to me again. Here we are on the other side of the flood. We still have this problem. Fine. I'm going to divorce you. I'm going to disinherit you. I'm no longer going to have a personal relationship with you. Instead, I'm going to disinherit you and assign you to lesser gods, to the sons of God. I'm going to divvy you up and assign your domain to one of them, and vice versa. The parallel passage to Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9 is Deuteronomy 4, 19, and 20, where the Israelites are told, don't worship the host of heaven. Those beings, those guys who have been allotted to the nations and the nations to them. So this is a punishment. Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9 describes a punishment. God severing the relationship. I'm just going to put you under the authority of the sons of God, some of us who work for me. If that's what you want, you don't want me as your God, I'm going to give you what you asked for. We'll see how that works. Now we know God turns in the biblical story right after Babel, calls Abraham and says, essentially, I'm going to start over. Okay? I've divorced them. I'm going to start over. I'm going to have my own people. That's why verse 9 says, Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. Okay? I'm going to start over. But when he makes the covenant with Abraham, notice what he does. He says to Abraham, I'm going to make you stars in the sky, all this great stuff. You're going to have offspring. But then he says in verse 3, Genesis 12:3, right after Genesis 11, the Bible story, he says, through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. So he hasn't forgotten the nations completely. But he's also not in direct relationship with them. Now we know from Acts 17, Paul refers to this event in his sermon on Mars Hill. And he says, again, something to the effect that, God, set these boundaries so that one day, people in the nations could find their way back to the true God. Now, Paul viewed himself as part of that mission. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. But that was part of the purpose. We're not told exactly how it worked. Israel is called to a kingdom of priests. What do priests do? They mediate the relationship between the divine and the human. Israel is described in certain ways that the nations were supposed to be attracted back to the true God because of them, because of their just laws, because of the way they lived, because of the victories their God had given them. All these things that you read about in the Old Testament. This was the idea, but in Psalm 82, God is angry because the sons of the Most High have become corrupt. They have manipulated and undermined and abused the people of the nations under their charge. Now, it's going to have a significant payoff. Let's just skip ahead here. Right here. Here's the whole psalm. How long will you gods, judge unjustly, show partiality to the wicked, all this bad stuff? Basically you're causing lots of upheaval, and again, the Bible just has this as in heaven, so on earth thing going on, so it affects, the symbiotic relationship between the spirit world and the physical world. Foundations of the earth are shaken. You're gods, sons of the Most High, all of you, nevertheless you're going to die like men. God says, I'm going to punish you for this. You are going to die like men. That alone suggests they aren't men to begin with. You're going to die like men. You're going to fall like any prince. And then the psalmist says at the end, arise, O God, judge the earth, for, look at the phrase, you shall inherit all the nations. You're going to get them back. Please take them back. This is the vision of the Old Testament. Go back here. This whole idea is the backdrop for what we would call, and what scholars would call, cosmic geography in the Old Testament. This is part of the Old Testament worldview, the supernatural worldview. Yes, there's God, the God of Israel, but there are lots of gods. Some of them are loyal to him, some of them are his enemies. He assigned the nations to those other gods, and the gods to those nations as a punishment at Babel. They became corrupt. They seduced the Israelites. If you read through the book of Deuteronomy, where a lot of this stuff is that we've been talking about tonight, the Israelites get seduced by these other gods to worship them instead of Yahweh. The whole story of the Old Testament goes back to this thinking. It's Yahweh against the gods and Israel against the nations. This is why. This is the Old Testament rationale for why the nations have pantheons, why they have other gods, why we have this antipathy between them and us. It's because of this judgment and the corruption of beings that were initially loyal to Yahweh, members of his council, who became corrupt. And the Old Testament story is we're living with the results. There's lots of other things that go into the Old Testament worldview, but I'm just landing here for now. There are some interesting passages. I'll just give you, I have 3 examples here of how this plays out. My personal favorite is 2 Kings 5. This is the story of Naaman, the leper, a skin disease. So again, if you know the story, let me just do a quick time check here. Okay. If you know the story, Naaman has this horrible skin disease, and he can't do anything about it. So this little slave girl that apparently got captured at some point, taken to Syria, where Naaman's at, he's a Syrian, says to him, well, why don't you just go to Israel and have Elisha the prophet cure you? You dummy? I mean, she doesn't say that, but I mean, that's essentially, what you get out of it. And he's like, okay, I'll try that. So he gets a bunch of his men, goes down, and the prophet won't even meet with him. He doesn't even come out to meet with him. This is an important guy. He's captain of the guard in Syria. He's the king's personal assistant. And Elisha says, just tell him to go dip himself 7 times in Jordan and he'll be okay. And then he throws a fit. You remember the story. He's real mad. He's going to leave. And his entourage says, if he had said do something spectacular, you would have done it. Why don't you just do this simple thing and just give it a try? So he does. And again, if you know the story, he's healed. He goes back to Elisha, and what does he ask for? He says, I know now that Yahweh is the God of gods. If it's okay with you, I'd like to do what? Anybody remember?
Get some dirt.
Yeah. Would it be okay if I load my mules with dirt so I can take it back with me? What? Dirt? You want dirt? Why dirt? And the narrative explains a little bit. He says, well, part of my job is I have to go into the temple of Ramon, he's a Syrian god, with the king. And the king's kind of old, and he's going to bow before Ramon, right? He's going to lean on me, and I'll kind of bow too, because I got the king on my side here. It's just kind of awkward. It doesn't really tell us what he wants to do with the dirt. But the concept is clear. Israel's dirt is holy ground. It is dirt, it is ground associated with the God of Israel, the God of gods. So he wants to know if it's okay to take the dirt back with him. And we're not told, did he wear a little around his neck in a pouch? Did he put some in his pockets? We don't know what he did with it. Did he sprinkle a little bit when he had to go to the temple of Ramon? I don't know. But he wants it with him. He wants the dirt. It only makes sense in a worldview that treated the gods seriously. Cosmic geography. When Dagon, when the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, and they take it into the temple of Dagon. And, again, that's a familiar Sunday school story. It's kind of comical. They put it in there with Dagon. The next day, Dagon's nothing but a stump. His arms and his legs and his head are cut off. And he's just toppled there on the floor. And the Philistines get freaked out and say, we need to get rid of this thing. We know the story, but we don't know a little throwaway part of it. In that story, it says this. After they find Dagon in a stump, it says that, unto this day, the priests of Dagon do not walk across the threshold. Why? Because that little piece of turf inside Dagon's temple is under dominion of another god, namely the God of Israel, because he made mincemeat out of Dagon. So even though they're doing their thing in Dagon's temple, when they get to the spot where they found Dagon, they walk around. And it's cosmic geography. 1 Samuel 26, David is upset because he's been driven out of Judah. And he says, what am I going to do now? How can I pray to the God of Israel? David is not denying omnipresence. He associates the worship of Yahweh of Israel with Israel, with Judah, with holy ground. He's in Philistine territory now. He doesn't quite know what to do. It bothers him. Again, this is just the way the Old Testament Israelites would have thought about their God, the other gods, gods of the nations. They took it seriously. They were real entities for them. Daniel chapter 10 is probably a little bit familiar. there are supernatural princes assigned to the nations. Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece, Michael is the Prince of Israel, Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. It's the same idea. There is a direct relationship between certain divine beings and certain geographical locations, regions, nations, whatever. And this is the Old Testament worldview. We can talk a little bit about the Edenic vision here, what the point is. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. But why all the, why are the nations important is really what it comes down to. And it comes down to the fact that in the beginning, again, this is Genesis 1, God created humanity in the biblical story. He creates Eden. Eden is where he lives. It's his abode. It's his residence. It's his home office, because where he is, his counsel is as well. It's where he does business. Heaven comes to earth. And God decides to make humanity a part of that. He wants to be Lord of all of humanity, not just a portion, but all of it. And that's the original vision. We get plural language here. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. And let them rule over the fish of the sea and so on. Then it switches to singular here. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he created him. We've got plural and singular. Why the plurals? What is the image? What's the point? I'm not going to go into a long lecture about the image. I spent 2 chapters in the book on it. The image of God is not a thing put in you. It is not an attribute you have. I used to teach ethics class in a Christian college, and I always looked forward to the day when we would talk about abortion, because I knew what I was going to do to them. I would walk in, and how many of you are pro-life? Most of the hands are going to go up. It's Christian college, and I would say, why? Well, human life is sacred. Why? Well, the image of God. Really? What is the image of God? You get all sorts of answers. The ability to pray, intelligence, ability to commune with God, having a spirit, having a nefesh, having a soul, all these things. When you point out to them that spirit and nefesh, spirit and soul in the Old Testament, are also assigned to animals, and you ask them questions like, well, does the little cellular thing in the contents of the woman's womb, can that pray? Does that have intelligence? Does it have any attribute associated with a functioning brain? No. So I'd say, why? Why do you pro-life? See, what I wanted them to see was that it is flawed thinking in terms of biblical theology to define the image as any attribute, any quality that a human being has, because humans don't possess all these qualities equally and all at the same time. And you can lose intelligence, Alzheimer's, you can't link this idea to attributes. And the biblical person didn't either. There's a point of Hebrew grammar that actually parses this really well. The image of God is not a thing given to us. The key is, what does in his image mean? How do we use the word in? If I say, put the dishes in the sink, what do I mean? I'm talking about location. If I say, I broke the vase in pieces, what do I mean? I'm using in there to denote result of an action. If I say that the paper was written in pencil, I'm using in to denote an instrument. See, we use the word in lots of semantic ways. If I say, I work in medicine, what do I mean? I work as a doctor or a PA or a nurse or something. It describes my function or my role. That, in Hebrew grammar, is called the bet essentia, or the bet predication. That is what the image of God is. It is a role. It is a status. It is a function. It is not an attribute. If you are human, you are God's image. That's what it means. Just to be human is to be the image. Because in biblical thinking, other nations would make idols, objects that represented their gods. Israelite theology didn't allow for that. Orthodox Israelite theology. Instead, God made humans to be his likeness. It's a status. It is what you are. The plurals tell us that God made other beings to represent him too. In the spirit world, heavenly hosts, this is who God is speaking to. This is not a trinity. There's no way to exegetically restrict this to three. God is speaking to his heavenly host. They are his images as well. He's saying, we're going to create beings down here, and they're going to represent me too. And they're going to share some relationship with you guys. Namely, they're going to image me like you image me. And you're also going to have attributes, and you may not have the attributes all equal. And humans, we all have different sets of abilities. But we all have the same status. We're his images. The same with them. It's the equivalent of me saying, hey, let's go get pizza. Let us get pizza. And then we all get in my car, and I pay, and you enjoy it. You participate. This is why it goes from plural to singular, because when the actual creation happens, there is only one creator. And there is only one task to represent him in whatever domain you're in. Humans, it's earth. Spiritual beings, it's the spirit world. Again, this is part of biblical thinking. They took the supernatural context of who they were, who humanity was, and the task to make the whole world like this place. We can all be one big family, divine beings with us, who are embodied with God. God's presence is here. God is also spoken of anthropomorphically in Genesis 3. He's walking around. One big happy family, one place, heaven meets earth. Isn't this wonderful? That's the biblical vision. But, it doesn't work that way. By the time you get into chapter 11, in the biblical story in Genesis, it's all ruined. Now we've got God against the gods, Israel against the nations. And that's the way it is for the rest of the Old Testament, and frankly, a lot of the New Testament as well. Now, the key point here is, do we think like this? In the book, I'm basically arguing in the early parts of the book that to really understand how the biblical writers were thinking, and this is again just one point, even though it's a fundamental point, but they were predisposed to thinking in supernatural terms. The supernatural world is real. It not only intersected with their world, but our world has its destiny tied to that world and vice versa. It never went away. They were that was where they were at. That was what they were thinking. In my experience, most people, again, who want to take the Bible seriously, don't think that way today. I've got God, Jesus, angels, demons, Satan, maybe, and I'm about done now. The spiritual world of the Old Testament and the New Testament is a whole lot wider than that. And there's a whole lot more going on. I only gave you a couple of examples. But they were predisposed to thinking this way. And if they were, the stuff that they wrote is written from that perspective. So you have to have that in your head to understand lots of things that are going on in Scripture. All these weird passages. Why does it say in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul says, stop suing each other, stop going to secular courts. Don't you know that you're going to judge angels? What? It goes back to this. Even the head covering goes back to this. all sorts of throwaway statements where Jesus goes, what he says when he gets there, is tied to Old Testament cosmic geography in many places. Those places have a history, and it often isn't a good one. And the gospel writers are picking and choosing what they want to tell us about the life of Jesus, what he does, what he says. And in many cases, they're very deliberate about what they relate. For a person in the first century would have caught a lot of these things immediately. We don't, because we're just from another time and place. So, again, what I'm going to try to do, we'll take a little break. I want to hit specifically Godhead thinking in the Old Testament, and then talk about how this filters into the New Testament as well. So, is Will here? I don't see Will. I don't really see much of anybody actually. Just the light. You want to just break for 5? How do you want to do it?
Sure. Yep.
Potty break?
Sure.
Water break?
Yep.
Some other kind of break?